These are the 10 key things to know about Unit 6, the President, Budget, and Bureaucracy. First up, Presidential Qualifications, Term, and Related Amendments. Article 2 of the Constitution says that anyone who wishes to run for the President must be at least 35 years old, a natural-born U.S. citizen, and a 14-year resident of the United States. The President serves a 4-year term once elected and is elected by the Electoral College. The 20th Amendment of the Constitution changed the inauguration date from March to January 20th to avoid the lame duck presidency situation in which an outgoing president may stay in office for months with a new Congress in place. The 22nd Amendment created the limit of 2 terms consecutively for office, or a 10-year maximum consecutive term. And the 25th Amendment created a formal succession line, making the Vice President, Speaker of the House, and President pro tempore next in line to the presidency. Number 2 deals with the powers of the presidency, and we'll start with the ones that are actually listed in the U.S. Constitution. They include sending and receiving ambassadors, faithfully executing all laws, appointing federal judges, delivering a State of the Union each year to Congress, granting pardons and amnesties, proposing a budget to Congress, signing treaties with other foreign leaders, making him the chief diplomat, signing or vetoing legislation, and being the commander-in-chief of the military. There are, of course, some powers that the President utilizes that are not in the Constitution, and we refer to those as inherent powers. Things like executive agreements and executive orders that have a temporary time span in which they are in place, the ability to expand our land, and the use of executive privilege, which, of course, was called into question in the case of U.S. versus Nixon. Number 3, we'll look at the balance in the relationship between the President and the Congress, which is a key piece of checks and balances in our Constitution. There are several things built into the Constitution to try to create balance between the executive and legislative branches. They include the impeachment and removal process, the veto and veto override process, the President's ability to use executive orders, the fact that the Office of Management and Budget has to send a proposed budget to the Congressional Budget Office for studying, the Senate's advice and consent or confirmation power over all federal appointments, and the use of legislative oversight over the executive branch. It's important to remember that these 2 key laws were talked about in this unit that both deal with the balance of power between the President and Congress. The War Powers Resolution tried to limit some of the President's power as Commander-in-Chief, while the Budget Impoundment Act was created by Congress, in which they created the CBO, a budget calendar, and set up budget committees in both houses of Congress that take some of the President's Treasury powers away from him. A key institution in helping the President enforce policies is his Cabinet. The Cabinet is responsible for advising the President in all critical areas, and today there are 15 Cabinet departments. Originally there were only 4. Every Cabinet department is led by someone with the title of Secretary, except of course for the Justice Department, which is led by the Attorney General. The Cabinet is responsible for enforcing all binding policies, and every appointment to the Cabinet must go through the Senate through the advice and consent process or confirmation process. The Cabinet must enforce policies in a nonpartisan way, as the Civil Service Act has stipulated. This sometimes creates frustration for the President, as he cannot use the Cabinet as a pure means to push his political agenda. 2 other key components that help the President each day are his executive office and his White House staff. The executive office has 3 components: the National Security Council, which brings his state and defense departments together, his Council of Economic Advisors that help advise him on how to combat things like inflation and unemployment, and perhaps his most important is the Office of Management and Budget that helps him write his proposed budget for Congress each year. Because all 3 of these have policy-making influence and policy enforcement influence, everyone who is appointed to each of these 3 agencies must be confirmed in the U.S. Senate. On the other hand, there's the White House staff, which is closest to the President on a daily basis. It is led by his Chief of Staff, and then his National Security Advisor, who is close to the President on almost every major foreign policy issue. He also has his press secretary, who speaks to the media each day. Because these people aid the President but do not have an official policy-making role, they do not have to be confirmed in the U.S. Senate. For number 6, we look at the things that you have to know about the federal budget. We'll start with the fact that any time that the government is bringing in more money, that means its revenue is exceeding the amount that it's spending, expenditures or appropriations, then it has a surplus. If the opposite is true and the government is spending more money than it's bringing in, we would say it's running a deficit. In terms of bringing money in, or revenue, the most popular way the government does this is through the federal income tax. The federal income tax is a progressive tax because the more money an American makes, the more they're going to pay in their taxes each year. The government also brings money in by borrowing, by selling bonds and taking out loans from other countries. In terms of state governments, they get some extra revenue, as some states have sales tax that applies to certain things that you may purchase in their state. Because the sales tax is a base rate for everyone, some people consider it regressive because it affects lower income Americans more than higher income. In terms of spending their money, the government basically has two types of expenditures, those that are discretionary and those that are uncontrollable. Discretionary things can actually be changed from year to year, like the military budget or the budget on education. But uncontrollable expenditures are things that Americans are qualifying for every single day, and thus the government can't really cut them or balance them. Things like entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare become very difficult to control, as well as the interest on our national debt and the aid that goes to war veterans. For number 7, we look at the organization and components of our federal bureaucracy, and it's first important to note that the bureaucracy is considered a hierarchy because it is top-down, with the White House staff being the closest to the president each day, and working its way down to the regulatory agencies and various government corporations that we deal with on a daily basis. The bureaucracy gets a lot of independence in terms of how they get to implement their policies. The system is so complex because there are so many agencies that get to make their own rules, and many of those rules overlap with the various other agencies. To recruit their members, the agencies oftentimes look to the very industry that they're regulating. For example, the Food and Drug Administration may look to somebody who worked in the pharmaceutical field before because they have expertise on how to regulate these types of drugs and the effects they have on people. Agencies are regularly consulting the industries they regulate to make more realistic guidelines and expectations. Congress gives the bureaucracy the authority to enforce these regulations because, first, many members of Congress lack the in-depth knowledge about the industry to be able to regulate it. Also, Congress has a lot of other things going on, and they don't have the time or resources to go out and actually implement their own policies. Finally, Congress members have to go up for re-election. They don't want the political consequences that might come with a perceived poor implementation of a policy. So how do people get those nice, cushy government jobs? Well, for the longest time in the United States, it was all based on patronage. It was about who you knew. Once a party got into power, they'd hook up all their friends and reward them with government jobs for being loyal to the party or donating money to their campaigns. Andrew Jackson once referred to it as the spoil system. But by the late 1800s, people were growing very tired of this corrupt system, and the Pendleton Civil Service Act helped correct a lot of these issues. It created a merit-based civil service system in which getting a government job started with passing an entry-level exam, and then being rewarded with higher pay on a general schedule scale was all based on your level of experience and competency in your job. The Hatch Act of 1939 took this further by prohibiting any government employees from being able to participate actively in electioneering or campaigning for a politician. The biggest federal government employer today is the Defense Department, as there have been many jobs created and trickled down through the state and local levels for this department. We see it right here in our community with all the jobs created by APG. For number 9, students should reflect back on a concept that we talked about last unit known as legislative or congressional oversight. This, of course, is how Congress tries to keep the bureaucracy in check and make sure that they're implementing policies effectively. Some of the ways that Congress works to do that is by holding public, media-filled investigative hearings, auditing the agencies to see where the money's going and where confidential documents are, and refusing to spend money on certain budget requests that agencies may have. Finally, students want to go back and reflect on the concept of the iron triangle or subgovernment. This, of course, is the belief that the policy-making process basically funnels through three institutions: the committees of Congress, interest groups, and the bureaucracy, and that each of them provides important resources that can help the other two out during the process. For the first free response, you want to go back and look at all those examples of the ways that the President and Congress can check each other, but you also want to go beyond the surface. You want to think, because they realize that the other branch can check them, how does it affect their decision-making? For example, Congress knows the President can go right around them and make an executive order. How might that affect their thought process in trying to get a law passed? For the second free response, it's an in-depth look at the bureaucracy, how it's made up, what types of agencies there are and what they regulate, why Congress gives the bureaucracy the authority to regulate things in the first place, and how Congress uses oversight to keep the bureaucracy in check.